seated, please.
All right, we are back on. Defendants present, represented by counsel. Got a little bit of movement going on, but I think we're good. I understand the state is ready to proceed with its next witness.
State's ready, Judge.
All right, just make sure if we have any additional movement, let's get everybody in if they're supposed to get in. Okay, yeah, let's go ahead. Let's get the panel.
All rise for the jury, please. Please sit.
Welcome back. Hopefully everybody did enjoy their lunch. We are ready to proceed with the evidence in the case. I appreciate everybody's attention. Stay ready to proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the state calls Agent Jason Seacrist. Agent Jason Seacrist.
Swear to tell the truth, whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I will.
Go ahead, have a seat.
Good afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon.
Go ahead and introduce yourself to the jury. Tell them your name and spell it for the court reporter.
My name is Jason Seacrist, Seacrist.
And how are you employed?
I'm an assistant special agent in charge at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation.
Okay. And what is the Georgia Bureau of Investigations?
The GBI is a state law enforcement agency that's primarily tasked with assisting local law enforcement or other law enforcement agencies in criminal investigations.
Okay. And is the GBI made up of like two different sections, the crime lab and the investigative division?
That's correct. There are actually 4 divisions in the GBI, 2 of which are the investigative division and the division of forensic science.
Okay. So what's the difference between those 2 divisions, just briefly?
The investigative division is tasked with doing exactly what it sounds like, which is conduct the actual criminal investigation. Part of that would be conducting interviews. Part of that would be collecting evidence. And once those items are done, then they are turned over, evidence is turned over to the Division of Forensic Science for actual scientific testing.
Okay. And where is the headquarters located?
Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. Now, other than the headquarters, are there various regions with different offices?
Yes, ma'am. The investigative division is divvied up into 15 regional field offices that each cover, generally speaking, about 10 counties.
Okay. And which region are you assigned to?
I'm assigned to the Region 4 field office in Douglas, Georgia. We cover 11 counties.
Okay. And how long have you been with the GBI?
Approximately 10 years.
Any previous law enforcement experience?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, what are your primary duties in your position there with GBI?
Currently, I'm a supervisor out of our office. Our office has 5 field agents, 2 crime scene specialists, an office manager. I am, again, the assistant special agent in charge, and then the special agent in charge is the top supervisor in the office.
Okay. And are you post certified?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
What does that mean?
So POST stands for the Peace Officer Standards and Training Council. They're the ones that establish the credentials for becoming a police officer in the state of Georgia. Being post certified means that you have completed the what's known as the Police Academy, and then every year after that you've also completed additional training to maintain your certification.
Okay. And as a post certified agent with the GBI, do you have arrest powers under Georgia law?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, I want to turn your attention to the investigation into the death of someone by the name of Ahmaud Arbery. Are you familiar with that investigation?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you become involved in that investigation at some point?
Yes, I did.
Okay. How did you become involved?
On the morning of May 6th of 2020, I received a phone call from one of our command staff. She advised that I was being tasked to assist the regional office in Kingsland in the investigation into the death of Ahmaud Arbery.
Okay. Now, were you being assigned the lead role in that investigation?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Do you know who was assigned the lead role in that investigation?
Assistant Special Agent in Charge Richard Dial.
Okay. And you said you became involved on May 6, 2020?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So at the point where you got the call, what did you do?
I packed my bags and I came over to Kingsland.
Okay.
I got the call about 9 o'clock in the morning, and I arrived at the Kingsland office at about 12:30.
Okay. Now, what were your duties as it pertains to the investigation itself?
Primarily was just to assist ASAC Dial in whatever investigative leads were need to be followed. Eventually, it culminated primarily into 2 tracks of the investigation, one being Mr. Roddy Bryan and one being Mr. Larry English. And then, of course, with other miscellaneous, I would say, interviews or lead follow-up as they occurred.
Okay. So when you essentially got to Agent Dial, were you briefed on the investigation thus far?
Yes, ma'am, I was.
Okay. And was that from Agent Dial?
It was. It was from Agent Dial, and as we were beginning to review the investigative work that had already occurred.
Okay. Now, were you given the file of Glynn County Police Department?
Yes, we were.
Okay. Are you familiar with the term neighborhood canvass?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell us what that is?
A neighborhood canvass is where you go to an area where a crime has occurred, and you knock on every door that you can find in that area, trying to identify additional witnesses or people who had additional information regarding the incident.
Okay. And to your knowledge, did GBI agents in this case do neighborhood canvasses?
That's correct.
Okay. Are you familiar with a neighborhood by the name of Fancy Bluff?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
Okay. And was that neighborhood a part of the canvassing in this case?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Okay. Where is Fancy Bluff located in proximity to Satilla Shores?
It is directly across, I think it's Highway 17, probably within a mile or 2 of where the incident occurred.
Okay. Now, did you participate particularly in any of that neighborhood canvass?
Not in the blanket neighborhood canvass, but I participated as it came to specific residences nearby in those areas where it had identified that we needed to do interviews.
Okay. Do you remember when you started doing interviews, like what date?
It was on May 7th.
Okay. Now, do you recall a couple by the name of Diego Perez and Brooke Perez?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Okay. How do you know them?
They were living in the neighborhood of Satilla Shores. I believe they were a couple residences away from Mr. English's property.
Okay. And did you interview them in this case?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Do you remember when you interviewed them?
It would have been on May 7th.
Okay. are you familiar with a couple by the name of Danielle Stoddard and her, not Stoddard, but Stoddard, and her husband, James Stoddard?
Yes, I am.
Okay, how are you familiar with them?
Again, there was an interview that was done at their residence.
Okay, when did you do that interview?
I believe it was also May 7th.
Okay, and are you familiar with a person by the name of Matthew Albenze?
Yes, ma'am, I am.
How are you familiar with him?
Mr. Albenze was the one who contacted the non-emergency line on the day of the incident, and he lived on Jones Road, and I believe I interviewed him there or participated in an interview.
Okay, and is that, what neighborhood was that in,
That
located
would be in Satilla Shores.
Okay, and the Stoddards, do you recall where they lived?
It was the Fancy Bluff area.
Okay. Now, you mentioned before that a part of your role in the investigation was the track of William Roddy Bryan.
That's correct.
Okay. At some point, did you interview Mr. Bryan?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Do you remember how many times you interviewed him?
There were 2 formal interviews, what I would call formal interviews.
Okay, and when was the first one?
The first one was on May 11th
Of what year?
of 2020.
Where was that interview, where did it happen? Where did it occur?
It occurred at the DNR regional office on, I believe it's Conservation Way here in Brunswick.
Okay, it's 196A. So, was that interview recorded?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Okay, was that video and audio?
That one was only audio recorded.
Okay, all right. And did you review that recording before coming to court today?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you review the whole thing?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you also review a transcript of that recording?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and was the transcript accurate as it pertains to what actually happened in the recording?
Yes, it was.
At this time, we would tender states 196 and 196A.
196 is the recording, 196 is the transcript.
Yes, sir.
Objection.
Objection.
No objection.
There it is.
Thank you. Now, Agent Seacrist, if you were to see Mr. Bryan in court, would you be able to recognize him?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, do you see him in court today?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Can you please point him out and describe what he's wearing?
He is sitting to the far right at the defense table in a blue jacket and looks like a gray shirt, wearing glasses.
Okay, let the record reflect that he has identified William Bryan. May I approach? Thank you. There you go. So, Agent Seacrist, I'm showing you what's been admitted as 196A. Do you recognize 196A?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Okay, what is it?
This is a transcript from my May 11, 2020 interview with Mr. Bryan.
Okay. Now, was Mr. Bryan under arrest at the time of this interview?
No, ma'am, he was not.
Okay. Was he detained in any way?
No, ma'am.
Was Mr. Bryan handcuffed at all?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Do you recall how he got to the interview location?
He drove on his own.
Okay. And was anyone else present during the interview?
During the interview, his attorney, Mr. Kevin Goff, was present, and another GBI agent by the name of Larry Kelly was present for a brief portion.
Okay. And do you remember what time it was when you interviewed him?
It was middle of the afternoon, maybe 2 o'clock hour, if I recall.
Okay. Would looking at the transcript help refresh your recollection?
I'm sorry, it's 3:40 p.m.
Okay. Now, did you promise Mr. Bryan that he would get anything of benefit from talking to you?
No, ma'am.
Did you promise him that he wouldn't be charged with a crime if he spoke with you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you promise him he would get some kind of lesser sentence or plea deal or anything like that if he spoke with you?
No, ma'am.
Did you make any promises to his attorney, Mr. Goff, as it related to his client getting any kind of benefit from speaking to you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you threaten Mr. Bryan in any way to talk to you?
I did not.
Now, did you actually explain to Mr. Bryan, even with his attorney there, that he didn't have to talk to you?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. And did you ask him if he understood that?
I did.
And what was his response?
He indicated that he did.
what, if anything, did you tell Mr. Bryan about leaving after the interview?
I advised Mr. Bryan that when the interview was completed, he would be able to go wherever he wanted to go. He would be free to leave.
Okay. And did he acknowledge that he understood that?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Did Mr. Bryan appear to be under the influence of any drugs or alcohol during the interview?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did he appear to understand what was going on?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And did you, in fact, specifically ask him if he's under the influence of anything?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did he say?
He said he was not.
Okay. Were there any limitations imposed on the May 11th interview?
There was.
And by whom?
Mr. Gall.
Okay, and what was that limitation?
The limitation on this interview was that we would only discuss things pertaining to what happened from the time he left the police department on February 23rd up to the current time.
Okay, current day being May 11th.
The date of the interview, yes, ma'am.
Okay, so nothing about the incident or before that?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, during the interview, how long was the interview? Do you remember, just like a ballpark?
I would say probably about an hour and a half.
Okay. So during that time, did a few questions come up that may have gone over those limitations?
They did.
Okay. And did you receive permission to still delve into those areas?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. So let's talk about the statements that Mr. Bryan made to you. Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan whether he knew Greg McMichael?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay. And what did he say?
He indicated that he knew him from the neighborhood and from his work at the hardware store.
Okay. Whose work at the hardware store?
Mr. Bryan's work at the hardware store.
Okay. And did you ask him if he knew Travis McMichael?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did he say?
He said he did not.
Okay. Now, where did Mr. Bryan say he lived?
At 307 Burford Drive in Satilla Shores.
Okay. And how long did he say he lived at that location prior to February 23rd, 2020?
He lived there approximately 3 years.
3 years, okay. Did he at any time mention anything about purchasing that home?
Yes, ma'am.
What did he say?
He said he had just bought the house approximately 2 weeks before the incident.
Okay, so 2 weeks before February 23rd, 2020.
Yes, ma'am.
He had just purchased it.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, according to Mr. Bryan's statement, did Mr. Bryan say that he could see the victim's hands as the victim was running during the chase?
Objection, Your Honor. We're going to be referring, we understood, from the pretrial order to the man's name, not a characterization.
Well, I made no specific ruling on it. What I did ask the state was to use terminology that was not, to just use terminology that didn't, over and over again.
Over and over again. That's what I understood, Your Honor. Yes, sir.
So again, I did not in place a word man, but if the state could
limit how many times I say it.
that would be preferable.
Yes, Your Honor, I will do my best. Let's see here. So, Agent Seacrist, according to Mr. Bryan's interview, did he talk about whether he was able to see Ahmaud's hands during this chase?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what did he say about that?
He could see his hands; they were out, and he appeared to not be holding anything.
Okay. And I want to turn your attention to page 76 of the transcript, beginning at line 21. And if you can just read that to the jury, that would be great. Thank you.
To which line? 21
76, line 21.
Through
25.
Okay. Okay. Were his hands out like normal running, like running arms, like moving back and forth, or were they in his pockets, or do you remember? Mr. Bryan responded, no, they were out.
Okay. Now, did Mr. Bryan ever see a gun or other weapon in the victim's hands during the chase at all?
He did not.
Okay. And did you speak with Mr. Bryan about any thefts in the neighborhood right before the incident happened?
I did.
Okay. Did you speak with him about thefts while he was living in Satilla Shores?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did he say he had anything stolen from him while he was living there?
He had.
Okay. Now, I want to turn your attention to page 84. lines 23 on to 85, line 10. If you can just read that, please.
Mr. Bryan said, I mean, the main thing was the trailer. It was 6x10, 8x10, 6x10, I think. Trailer behind the truck that went missing. And I'd have to clarify with a brother-in-law of what went missing out the back of his truck one night. But it was beer or something. I don't remember. Something petty. The trailer I never did report. Main reason, I didn't have it locked up and I was not sure when it went missing within a time frame of about a month. But now we're talking last year. I asked 2019. Mr. Bryan responded, yeah, man, it's been almost a year now.
Okay, so he had a trailer stolen from his residence,
Yes.
from the yard somewhere,
That's correct.
and that was in 2019.
Yes, ma'am.
And he said he never reported it to the police.
That's correct.
Okay, and he also mentioned about a brother-in-law
Yes,
who had some petty things stolen from how he characterized it.
that's correct.
Okay, other than that, did Mr. Bryan have any other specific thefts that occurred from his residence around that time?
No, ma'am.
Now, did Mr. Bryan mention about knowing about any kind of burglaries in the neighborhood, meaning breaking into houses?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you speak with him about knowing Ahmaud before that day?
Yes, ma'am.
What did he say? Did he know him?
He did not know.
Okay. Had he ever heard his name before?
No, ma'am.
Okay, so never met him, never heard his name.
No.
Okay. Did you speak with Mr. Bryan about knowing the owner of the 220 Satilla Drive construction site?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and who was the owner of that site?
Mr. Larry English.
And what did Mr. Bryan say about knowing Mr. English? And I'm going to turn your attention to page 95, lines 20 through 24, if you can read that.
I asked, do you know Larry English? Mr. Bryan responded, no, not at all. And I said, the guy that owns the house that's under construction out there as you're going out. Mr. Bryan responded, no, I didn't know who owned it.
Okay, so he had never spoken with Mr. English.
That's correct.
Okay. Now, did you speak with Bryan regarding hearing from other neighbors who lived in Satilla Shores about thefts?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And what did he say about hearing about thefts? And I'm going to point you to page 96, lines 11 through 13, and then 16 through 23. So first 11 through 13.
I said, okay, have you had any other neighbors talk to you about thefts in the area or issues? Mr. Bryan said, not neighbors talking to me. And then I went, within the last year and a half, let's say year and a half or 2 years. So let's go back to the beginning of 2019. How about that? Mr. Bryan responded, not neighbors talking to me. A couple of times they came into the shop and say, you know, man, something else went missing. They didn't say who, if it was them or what. But you know, stuff has been going missing in the neighborhood.
Okay. And that's line 23, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, during the course of the interview, did you come to find out that Mr. Bryan had surveillance cameras up at his property?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did those cameras face towards the front of the neighborhood, meaning Burford Road?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did he say it was okay for you to come by his house and search those cameras and
Yes,
the footage?
he did.
Okay. And what did you do after he said it was okay to do that?
I believe I got a consent form signed.
Okay. Now, was his attorney present for that discussion when you asked him for consent?
Yes.
Okay. So after he told you that you could do that, did you go by the house?
After the conclusion of the interview, we did.
Okay. And who was present for that meeting at the house?
Of course, Mr. Bryan, Mr. Goff, myself, Agent Kelly, and I believe also Mr. Bryan's fiance at the time, Miss Amy Elrod.
Okay. And were you guys able to download anything on that day?
Not at that time while we were there, no.
Okay. Why not?
I believe there was, if I remember right, it was password issues and also internet speed issues that were holding us back from being able to get the video then.
Okay. So between you and Agent Kelly, who's the tech person?
Agent Kelly.
Agent Kelly. Okay. So is that why Agent Kelly was there with you?
Absolutely.
Okay. At some point later on, were you all able to download that surveillance footage?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did you also follow up with Mr. Bryan about his cell phone and getting consent to search that cell phone?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did you get a form? Did you get him to sign like a consent form for that?
I believe I did. Yes.
Okay.
No objection.
May I approach, Judge?
Yes.
Okay. So, Agent Seacrist, I'm showing you what's been marked for identification purposes as State's Exhibit 197. If you can look at it and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, what is it?
This is the waiver of constitutional rights to a search warrant of an electronic or cellular device.
Okay, and is it the form that you had Mr. Bryan sign on May 11th, 2020?
Yes, it was.
Okay, does it seem to be altered in any way?
No, ma'am.
At this time, we tender States, is that 198?
197.
197.
No objection.
No objection. Sorry, I can't see.
No objection.
It's good.
Thank you. Permission to publish, Judge?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So, Agent Seacrist, I'm just going to have you, are you able to see what's projected?
I can.
Enough to read it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, let me try to zoom it in some. I don't break it. Okay, if you can just start from the top, that would be great. Okay. So if you can just read from here on down.
Waiver of constitutional rights to a search warrant of an electronic cellular device. I, William R. Bryan, Jr., having been informed of my constitutional right not to have a search and seizure made of my electronic/cellular device without a search warrant, and of my right to refuse to consent to such a search and seizure, hereby authorize Jason Seacrist/Larry Kelly of the GBI to use an extraction device to obtain information from my electronic/cellular device, including but not limited to any and all information, data, files, memory cards, photographs, videos, text messages, GPS locations, website information, emails, contact numbers, incoming and outgoing phone calls currently located on the below described device, iPhone 8, model MQ6 V2LL/A. I am giving this written permission to the above named investigator voluntarily and without threats or promises of any kind. I understand that any information derived from this evidence as a result of my consent to this search and seizure without a search warrant can and may be used as evidence against me in any court of law. I also have been provided contact information from the above stated investigator in order for me to withdraw my consent at any time. It is signed by Mr. Bryan. His name is printed below that. The time and date is written as May 11, 2020 at 3:54 p.m.
And whose signature is this?
That is mine.
And what about this one?
I believe that's Agent Kelly's.
Okay. And did you go over this form with Mr. Bryan before he signed it?
Yes, ma'am.
And did he appear to understand it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, after the May 11th interview, did Mr. Bryan leave freely?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Okay. And what did you do with this form? Did you contact another agent to get the phone extracted?
Yes, ma'am, Agent Kelly.
Okay. And what's an extraction, just briefly?
We use a device that actually plugs into the phone and just downloads all the information from the phone. It can also include not just information currently on the phone, but if information has been deleted from the phone, we can sometimes get that information. So it gives us all the content off the phone.
Okay. Now, during that May 11th interview with Mr. Bryan, what, if anything, did you tell him about him being a witness?
In my initial conversation with Mr. Bryan, I identified him as a witness, as it starts off right now. I said that we had a lot of investigative work to do and that we had additional questions that we needed specifics on, and that would be the course of the investigation.
Okay. And then you proceeded to have 2 separate interviews with Mr. Bryan.
2 separate sit-down interviews. That's
Sit-down
correct.
interviews,
Yes.
okay. And did you also do like a reenactment video
Yes,
at
ma'am.
some point?
We did.
Okay. And was that around the Satilla Shores neighborhood?
It was.
Okay. Now, going to your second interview with him, what date was that?
On May 13th, 2020.
Okay, and where was that? Where was the location of that interview?
That was in the same location at the DNR office on Conservation Way in Brunswick.
Okay, and was that interview also recorded?
Yes, it was.
Have you reviewed that recording in anticipation for your testimony today?
Yes, ma'am.
So when you reviewed the recording, Agent Seacrist, was it a fair and accurate copy of the recording of the video you did, the interview you did with Mr. Bryan?
Yes, it was.
Okay. And in conjunction with that, did you also review a transcript?
I did.
Okay. And did the transcript match up with the interview you did with him?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Any alterations or deletions?
No, ma'am.
Okay, I'm going to show you this 198A for identification purposes. Tell me if you recognize that.
I do.
What is it?
This is the transcript from the interview with Mr. Bryan on May 13th, 2020.
Okay. Your Honor, at this time we tender states 198 and 198A.
No objection.
No objection.
No objection.
It's admitted.
Thank you. And you can just hold on to them. So, same questions about this interview. Was he under arrest? Was Mr. Bryan under arrest at that time when you interviewed him on the 13th?
No, ma'am.
Okay, was he in handcuffs in any way?
He was not.
Was he detained in any way?
No, ma'am.
Who else was present, if anyone,
His
for that
attorney,
interview?
Mr. Goff,
Okay. And how did he get to the location?
on his own.
Okay. Now, remember what time it was when you interviewed him on May 13th?
I believe that one was in the 2 o'clock hour.
It was 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
Okay. If I were to show you a copy of your report that you did to summarize that, would that refresh your recollection?
It would. Yes, ma'am.
No, we have that marked as exhibit for the record.
Which part?
Summary report.
Seacrist, I am showing you what's been marked just for identification as 412, State's Exhibit 412. Look at it and tell me if you know what that is.
Yes, ma'am.
What is it?
This is my report that I wrote regarding my interview with Mr. Bryan on May 13, 2020.
Okay, just look at it silently to yourself and tell me if that refreshes your recollection about the time of the interview.
It does.
Okay, what time was it?
2:35 p.m.
Okay, thank you. I'll take that back. Okay, so did you promise him anything during that interview?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you make any threats towards him or force him to into any interview with you?
No, ma'am.
Okay. And did you make any promises to Mr. Goff, his attorney?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did Mr. Bryan appear to be under the influence of any drugs or alcohol?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did you explain to Mr. Bryan that he didn't have to talk to you?
I did.
And did he appear to understand that?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Okay. And did he still go ahead and proceed with the interview?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So let's get into some of his statements. What did Mr. Bryan say he was doing on the day of the incident when he noticed something was going on?
He was doing some work on his front porch.
Okay. And what did he say caught his attention?
Someone running and the sound of a vehicle engine.
Okay. And did Mr. Bryan say that he was listening to music or something like that?
He did. He was listening to music in his garage, which was on the opposite end of the house from where he was working outside.
Okay. But he could still hear a vehicle engine coming by.
That's correct.
Okay. And he said he saw somebody running as well.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did he say he knew what was going on at that time?
He did not.
Okay. I'm going to direct your attention to page 7, lines 24 into page 8, line 6. And if you could just read that, please.
Mr. Bryan said, and for whatever reason, I don't, well, I mean, at that point, I was like, okay, well, he's chasing him in the truck, whoever's in the truck, you know, and I'm figuring, I don't know what's going on at that point, but I'm figuring something's wrong. And I, not really loud, but I said, you got him, you need help, something like that. Nobody could hear me though, I'm sure.
Okay. And what did Mr. Bryan do after that?
He walked over and grabbed his keys.
Okay, and where were his keys?
His keys were in his kitchen, which he accessed through his door in the garage.
Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan what made him grab his keys?
I did.
And what did he say? I'm going to direct you to page 8, line 21, into page 9, line 2.
I asked, and why were you going back to your truck? Why were you grabbing your keys? Mr. Bryan responded, I guess just to go see what was going on, if anything needed to be done, if I could help, or whatever. I mean, I didn't know. I mean, to be honest with you, I don't know what I was doing.
Okay. So he said he wanted to know if he could help.
That's correct.
Okay. And I'm going to direct your attention to page 13, lines 18 through 25.
I asked, what was it that made you decide I need to go get my key and get in my truck and see what's going on? Mr. Bryan responded, I really don't know. I said, okay. And then Mr. Bryan said, I can't answer that. I don't know. It just, you know, I'm thinking through my mind that maybe he's done something. The guy running, and I don't know.
Okay. And when he left his house, did he have a cell phone on him?
Yes, ma'am, he did.
Okay. And what, if anything, did Mr. Bryan say about recognizing the truck in question? If you can just read page 9, lines 3 through 14.
Three through 14.
3 through 14.
I said, okay, now real quick, just going to go back. You said you recognized the truck. Mr. Bryan said, uh-huh. I said, where did you recognize? How did you? Why did you recognize the truck? Mr. Bryan responded, I mean, I've seen it in the neighborhood. I mean, at that time, I didn't know exactly why really I recognized it. I said, okay. Mr. Bryan said, I didn't know from what house, or if it had, just being in the neighborhood driving around. I didn't really put it together until afterwards.
Okay. Did Mr. Bryan ever say that he heard Ahmaud say anything during the chase?
He never heard Ahmaud say anything.
Okay. And did Mr. Bryan ever mention trying to slow down Ahmaud during the chase?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I want to direct you to page 33, line 16, to page 34, line 2. If you can just read that.
Mr. Bryan stated, I figured if I'd slowed him down and got a picture, that maybe something would happen in the end other than just him getting away and cops not knowing who he was. I said, so then that kind of makes me want to ask, why did the cops need to know? Mr. Bryan replied, because I figured he had done something wrong. I didn't know for sure. I stated, okay, what made you think he might have done something wrong? Mr. Bryan responded, it was just instinct, man. I don't know.
Okay. So he figured the victim had done something wrong, and it was just instinct that told him that.
Yes, ma'am. That's
That's
correct.
what he said. Okay. Now, did Mr. Bryan say that he felt the victim needed to stop running?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
I've lost track of how many times we've used the word victim here. I mean, that's the whole point. The jury's going to decide who the victim is here.
I can rephrase.
That's good. Ladies and gentlemen, the court has not banned the use of any words in this court. And what I had given the facts of this case and the positions of the parties, I asked the lawyer simply to use various terms. The witness can use whatever term he wants. And that's what's going on here. So if the state could refer to Mr. Arbery as Mr. Arbery and move on from there.
Yes, Your Honor. Now, Agent Seacrist, did Mr. Bryan say he felt Mr. Arbery needed to stop running?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And why did he feel that? Can you read page 37, line 5 through 10?
Mr. Bryan stated, yeah, I figured he stole something. I didn't know if he had shot somebody. I didn't know what was up. So I asked Mr. Bryan, had you heard any gunshots or anything like that? Mr. Bryan responded, no.
Okay. So Mr. Bryan said that he figured Ahmaud had shot somebody.
Yes, ma'am.
Object. First of all, asked and answered. Second, I object to the characterization. Mr. Seacrist has already given his testimony about what was said, word for word, and I object to the characterization after the fact by the prosecution.
Judge, I'm not characterizing it. It's what he said.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, what the lawyer's asking questions is not testimony. The testimony comes from the witness stand. It's sustained. Go ahead and ask your next question.
Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan whether he ever said anything to Ahmaud when he was chasing him?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Did he say he said anything to Ahmaud?
No, ma'am.
Okay. What, if anything, did Mr. Bryan tell Ahmaud regarding he needed to stop running?
He didn't say anything.
Okay. What, if anything, did Mr. Bryan tell Ahmaud about wanting to talk to him?
Mr. Bryan didn't say anything.
Okay. What, if anything, did Mr. Bryan tell Ahmaud about wanting to arrest him for anything?
Mr. Bryan didn't say anything.
Now, did Mr. Bryan ever say anything about Ahmaud turning to look at him right before he was shot and killed?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And I want to turn your attention to page 63, lines 2 through 18. I'm sorry, lines 12 through 18. If you can just read that, please.
Mr. Bryan stated, I think I remember seeing Ahmaud turn around and look towards me, pulling up or either almost pulled. No, I ain't quite stopped yet. I'm still back a good ways, I believe. Yeah, I'm still back a good ways. And then he runs around the right-hand side of the truck, and I figured at this point he's going to cut the corner and go out on Satilla Drive. Is that what it's called?
Okay. And at the point where Ahmaud is near the second truck, did Mr. Bryan ever hear Ahmaud say anything?
No, ma'am.
So he never heard him make any threats or anything like that?
He did not.
Okay. Did you ever ask Mr. Bryan if he saw Ahmaud drop anything from his hands during the chase?
I did.
Okay, and what did he say?
He said he didn't see him drop anything.
Okay. Now, I want to talk to you about your conversation with Mr. Bryan pertaining to Larry English's construction site, okay? Did you ask him if he had seen any of the videos,
I did.
okay, from that construction site? And what did he say?
He said he had not seen any of the videos.
Okay. Did you ask him if he even knew if the videos existed?
I did.
And what did he say?
He didn't know anything about videos.
Okay. Now, during the course of your investigation, did you learn that Satilla Shores, that the neighbors would communicate with each other on like a Facebook page?
I did.
Okay. Did you ask Mr. Bryan about his knowledge of that Facebook page?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did he say?
He was not a member and was not familiar with that Facebook page.
Okay. Now, did you follow up with Mr. Bryan about his knowledge of thefts in Satilla Shores around the time Ahmaud died?
I did.
Okay. And I want to turn your attention to page 85, lines 21 into page 86, line 21.
I asked, okay, so just to get a clear picture, the only specific thefts at the time of this event that you knew about from what you told me are your trailer. Mr. Bryan responded, uh-huh. Then I stated, your brother-in-law, some stuff out of the bed of your brother-in-law's truck. Mr. Bryan responded, uh-huh. I stated, anything else specific? Mr. Bryan said, specific, no. I had heard that there had been some. And I stated, that's just in general? And Mr. Bryan said, in general. I asked, but no real specific incidents? And Mr. Bryan said, nothing. You know, what was stolen, what house, where, when. I asked, when it happened? Mr. Bryan said, no. I said, what was, none, nothing? Mr. Bryan said, no. I said, only that, hey, there's some folks doing some, and when you talk about break-ins, what are you talking about? People going into houses, busting windows? Mr. Bryan responded, I think I heard a car. I said, car? Okay. Mr. Bryan responded, something about a car one time.
Okay. So he heard about a car one time.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Had he heard about any descriptions of the person who was allegedly responsible, person or persons, for any of this stuff?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So he didn't know if it was a black person, white person, Asian person, nothing?
He did not know.
Okay. Now, did you find out during the course of your interview with him that Mr. Bryan also had a Facebook account?
I did.
Okay. And did you ask for his consent to look at that Facebook account?
Yes, ma'am.
And was that when his attorney was still present?
Yes, ma'am.
And what did Mr. Bryan tell you?
He was willing to allow me to download his Facebook account, but the account was deactivated at the time, so we reactivated it so that we could.
So you reactivated it so that you could download it?
That's correct.
Okay. And did that download happen?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, after the interview concluded, was that your last time talking to him?
No, ma'am.
Okay. When was the next time?
Immediately after this interview was when we did the drive-through.
Okay. And when you say the drive-through, where drive-through in which neighborhood?
So we did a drive-through reenactment of the February 23rd in Satilla Shores.
Okay. And was that Mr. Bryan's route?
Yes, ma'am.
That pertained to his route?
It was.
Okay. And do you remember about what time you all went out there? Like, was it still light outside?
It was.
Okay, all right. And who all was present?
In the vehicle at the time would have been myself, Mr. Bryan, his attorney, Mr. Goff, and also another GBI agent, special agent in charge, Jamie Steinberg.
Okay. And was that recorded?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. May I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
Now, Agent Seacrist, were you able to review that recording prior to coming into court today?
Yes, ma'am.
And was it fair and accurate?
It was.
Okay. Did you also review a transcript of that recording?
I did.
Was that transcript fair and accurate?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Okay. I'm going to show you what's been marked for the purpose of identification as states 199A. Can you look at it and tell me what it is?
Yes, ma'am. This is the transcript from the reenactment with Mr. Bryan on May 13, 2020.
Okay. When you reviewed it, were there any alterations or anything like that?
No, ma'am.
Okay. At this time, we would tender states 199 and 199A.
Oh, no objection.
No objection.
No objection.
Admitted.
You can hold on to that. Now, before you hit record during that kind of reenactment, did anything happen in terms of any kind of preliminary drive-through?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, tell us what happened.
Mr. Bryan was having difficulty remembering the exact path of travel. So there was kind of a familiarization ride through to kind of get directly down to what the path of travel was before we actually recorded the reenactment.
Okay. But at any time, did you tell Mr. Bryan what to say?
Not at all.
Okay. Now, during your interviews with Mr. Bryan, did you learn from him that the police found some smudges on his truck?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did you also learn that those smudges had been lifted from his truck?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Did you speak with Mr. Bryan about getting fingerprints from him?
Yes, ma'am.
And why?
You get fingerprints from people who are known to use whatever the item is that has the fingerprints on it, to get what we call elimination prints, so that we can compare those to see if they're the person that the property belongs to or not.
Okay. And did he agree to give you fingerprints for that purpose?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did he consult with his attorney before agreeing with that?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you also speak with Amy Elrod about that?
Yes, ma'am.
And did she agree to give fingerprints as well?
She did.
Okay. And was that for the same purpose?
It was.
Okay. So at some point, did you meet with both of them?
Yes, ma'am.
When?
I believe it was the next day on May 14th.
Okay. And what happened when you met with them on that day?
I met them at, I believe it was the hospital parking lot, and we rode to the Glynn County Jail, where a jailer was able to take their fingerprints, and then I took them back to their vehicle.
Okay, so just to be clear, were they under arrest when they went to that jail?
No,
Okay,
ma'am.
it was just for the purpose of fingerprinting them.
That's correct. That was all pre-planned as far as the logistics of how that would happen.
Okay, all right. Now, at some point during the course of your investigation, did you ask Mr. Bryan for consent to download the computer system in his truck?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
Okay, and what happened? Did he give consent?
He did.
Okay. What, if anything, were you able to find?
Nothing that was pertinent to this investigation.
Okay, and why was that?
So the computers in your vehicles only store certain information for a brief period of time. So most of the data that was relevant to February had already been overwritten by May.
Okay. Are you familiar with a person by the name of Larry English?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and how are you familiar with Mr. English?
He's the owner of the house that was under construction where Mr. Arbery was seen on the videos.
Okay. During the course of this investigation, did you meet with Mr. English?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember where that meeting happened?
That meeting happened at his residence in McMichaels, Georgia, which is in Coffee County.
Okay. And what was the purpose of that meeting?
The purpose of the meeting was to get his statement regarding the investigation and what had occurred, especially to find additional videos that we had seen floating around and to get more context around his involvement and what led up to Mr. Arbery's death.
Okay. I want to turn your attention to May 21st, 2020. Okay. Was there anything noteworthy that happened on that day in terms of the investigation?
Mr. Bryan was arrested.
Okay. And any other warrants?
We did a search warrant of his house, and we also did a search warrant of his phone.
Okay. And were you present for that search warrant execution on his house?
I was.
Okay. Were other agents also present?
Yes, ma'am.
At the time you interviewed Mr. Bryan on May 11th and May 13th, had the video already surfaced? The video of this incident?
Yes, it had.
Okay. And had the McMichaels, had warrants already been signed for their arrests?
Yes.
Okay. Now, during the course of your investigation, did you learn that Mr. Bryan had given previous statements to officers from Glynn County PD?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And in preparation for your interview on May 11th and May 13th, did you review those statements?
I did.
Okay. And since those interviews, May 2020, have you reviewed those statements again?
Yes, ma'am, I have.
Okay. What, if anything, did you notice in Mr. Bryan's statements to the Glynn County Police Department as it compared to his statements to you?
His statements to the Glynn County Police Department were more direct in his involvement to corral and box in Mr. Arbery during the event. His statements to me minimized his involvement in that process that led to Mr. Arbery's death.
Okay, so we'll just talk about a few instances of that, okay? Were you able to review the transcripts of those statements given to Officer Minshew and Detective Lowry?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Objection here. I'm not sure where the state's going. Is this prosecutor about to ask a witness for his opinions about what other witnesses were told? Is he going to be giving his opinions to the jury about whether he thinks one statement is this and another statement is that, or is he testifying about what he knows? Because I'm trying to figure out how this line of questioning is proper, and I object to it.
Your Honor, both statements to Officer Minshew and Investigator Lowry were tendered, so they're in evidence. I'm not about to ask Agent Seacrist about his opinion on the statements. We're just going to go through a couple of the quotes from those statements in comparison to the statements to Agent Seacrist. But quotes, no opinions.
Again, that sounds like a closing argument, which is perfectly fine at its time. But this witness can testify to what this witness knows. And this line of questioning seems designed to put us in a position where we're going to have to make a motion that none of us wants to make.
Your Honor, I don't see how when the statements have come in already. They're in evidence.
That was never the point. It doesn't matter whether they're in evidence or not. The jury's already heard them. The jury will decide whether they're consistent or not. Whether Mr. Seacrist thinks they're consistent or not, that's something for the lawyers to argue. That's not for one witness. You can't call an expert witness to say whether they believe somebody or not. This is highly improper.
Yes, all you're doing is comparing the two statements.
Yes, Your Honor. I'm not going to ask him for his opinion.
But, I mean, if they're both in the record, what? I mean, he's taken one statement, and she took the other statement.
Yes, Your Honor. Well, Judge, I think it's completely relevant. I'm not going to go through both statements from front to back again, but I just wanted to pinpoint a couple areas where Mr. Bryan said something completely different to Agent Seacrist versus what he said in here to Officer Minshew and Detective Lowry.
30 years. I've never heard of any such thing. I think maybe we should take this up outside the presence of the jury.
Ladies and gentlemen, why don't you go ahead and take a step into the jury.
All rise for the jury.
Mr. Goff.
Your Honor, I object. The prosecutors laid this foundation that Mr. Bryan is characterized as changing his statements. That's well and good for a closing argument, but you can't call witnesses for the purpose of challenging credibility of the defendants in that way. Anybody. I have never even heard of such a thing being done in the trial of a criminal case, much less a murder case. You can't have one witness testify as to whether what another witness has been doing or editorializing as to what he thinks that means. He can testify to what he knows. This is highly improper. Highly improper.
And Judge, I'm not asking Agent Seacrist to editorialize anything. I'm going to ask him about specific quotes, not a lot of them, a couple, from each statement, and then ask him what Mr. Bryan said specifically to him on the same subject. That's it. Not to ask him how they differ or,
The objection is the state. He can testify to what his statement was. If the state wants to go ahead and argue differences in the statement, you're welcome to do so as part of the argument. But for him to comment on a statement given to another officer, of course not going to permit that. So that's sustained. Let me also address since we've got a break here, with the use of the term victim. Let me be very clear, because you mentioned a pre-trial ruling. The court has not implemented a word ban in this case. What I said and what I think was told to me at the time was that I generally don't implement word bans, and what I was told was that everybody would be very cognizant of that and understand that that term in this particular case brings a number of issues in. What I was told by the state was there was going to be an attempt to at least reduce the use of that. I sustained the objection because the court saw that as being the term that was being used with this witness. That word ban is still not in place, because I realized after I'd made my ruling it sounded like I'd changed that. That is not the case. The court found under these circumstances that was the term that you were using over and over to describe Mr. Arbery under these circumstances. So I just wanted to clear that up. So the court's ruling, pre-trial ruling, has not changed. I just want everybody to be aware of the terminology we're using under the circumstances and facts of this case. So
Yes, Your Honor.
let's go ahead and get the panel.
jury. Please seated.
All right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready to proceed with the evidence from the state.
Agent Seacrist, what did Mr. Bryan say to you in your interview with him on May 13th regarding the moments when he left his driveway? If you can turn to page 25 of the May 13th statement, lines 18 into page 26, line 19.
Mr. Bryan stated, and, you know, for whatever stupid reason again, I mean, there's going to be some reasons here that I don't understand why I did it. I jumped out in the road from my driveway at about the same time he got there. I asked, so did you like straight out? Mr. Bryan responded, yeah. So I asked, so you didn't go left or right, you just kind of went straight. Mr. Bryan responded, straight, well, maybe a tad to the left. I asked, angled a little bit? Mr. Bryan responded, just a tad. I said, okay. And why did you pull out and angle it to the left like that? Mr. Bryan responded, I guess so I could see. I said, okay. And what did you see? Mr. Bryan responded, and I'm thinking at this point, you know, I mean, it's running through my mind at this point. Try to get a picture. I said, okay. Mr. Bryan said, but I hadn't got my phone out. I don't believe at this point. I said, okay. Mr. Bryan responded, all right, what did I see? I seen him run right, straight in front of my truck. I asked, around the hood? Mr. Bryan responded, around the hood, through the ditch.
Okay. So at any point as he's describing going from his driveway to Burford Road, did Mr. Bryan ever say that he tried to force Mr. Arbery into the ditch in front of his house?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Did he at any point say he tried to block him?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, did you talk to Mr. Bryan about the circumstances surrounding his belief that Mr. Arbery tried to get into his truck somehow?
I did.
Okay. So I want to turn your attention to page 28, line 20, starting from the word he, into page 29, line 14. And if you can just read that, I'm sorry.
Mr. Bryan said, he was just down there low, not in the road. He comes up out of there at about the time we get around a tree, and we got really close to each other. I pull him past him, and this is another one where I'm really fuzzy at, man. But the only one neighbor that, and at the time I don't remember if I knew his name or not, but there is a neighbor, Tommy, up there, and I angled up into his drive with kind of like a mailbox there. All right. I don't know what the hell I was doing there, all right? Because at about that point I realized I'm in front of him. He's behind me. My windows are down. I said, uh-huh. Mr. Bryan continued, all right, and he's coming. So I backed up to try to get straight, and at that point he's on me. He's coming. He's on me. And I'm just like, man, I got to get out of here. So, I mean, I think I put it in drive or whatever at that point. I'm trying to haul ass, and he's on my door with his hands at the door handle. I hit gas, you know, keeping in mind I'm not trying to swing the boards out the back, you know.
So in him describing that incident to you, at any point did Mr. Bryan say he tried to corner Ahmaud?
No, ma'am.
At any point did he say he tried to cut him off or he had cut him off real good?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Now, in your statement, in your interview with him, did you confront Mr. Bryan about using the word block in his previous statement to the police officers versus what he told you?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay? And what did he say? And I'll turn your attention to page 26. I'm sorry, page 33. So it starts at line 11. Line 11 to line 15 for now.
Okay. I said, were you trying to, because I think in your original statement, and again, I'm not trying to pin you down, I'm just going back because I have to listen to it all. You talk about trying to box him in and do different things. Were you?
Okay. And go ahead and read from line 16 through 19.
Mr. Bryan responded, I figured if I slowed him down and got a picture, that maybe something would happen in the end, other than just him getting away and cops not knowing who he was.
Okay. And go ahead and read to lines 25.
I responded, so then that kind of makes me want to ask, why did the cops need to know? Mr. Bryan responded, because I figured he had done something wrong. I didn't know for sure. I said, okay, what made you think that he might have done something wrong?
And flipping the page, lines 1 and 2.
Mr. Bryan responded, it was just instinct, man. I don't know.
Your Honor, at this time, I would like to publish the reenactment video. Permission to publish that? It's been admitted. Yes.
Yep. All right. So I thought I was going to try.
So, Judge, the way we agreed with the defense to play this is on mute with Agent Seacrist narrating.
Say that with my agreement would be incomplete.
That was not your agreement?
You know what? You just go ahead. You go right ahead. I withdraw my objection.
Okay. McMichaels?
No objection.
So, Agent Seacrist, can you see
I can.
on your screen? Okay, so I'm going to press play. Where are you right now?
We are sitting in the driveway of Mr. Bryan's residence. We are backed in.
Okay, and that's 307 Burford Road?
That's correct.
Okay, and who is seated in the driver's seat?
I'm in the driver's seat.
And who is seated in the front passenger seat?
Mr. Bryan.
Okay, and who is seated in the back?
On the back seat, we have Mr. Goff and we have Jamie Steinberg.
Okay. So if you could just tell the jury.
Yeah, he's telling us right now where, as he's getting in his car and what he's fixing to do. He wants to drive out, and he's angling to the left in the direction that they went. And he's saying right around here is where Mr. Arbery pops up. So he's backing up because it surprises him. Doesn't back in quite enough to where when he makes the turn, he's getting close. He says he's about to hit his mailbox, and Mr. Arbery is down in the ditch. And they're running, he's running somewhat parallel to the vehicle, to his vehicle.
Okay, so I'm going to pause.
Mhm.
Do you see the ditch? In the
Yes,
video?
ma'am, I can.
Can you step down?
I can.
please, briefly? And don't touch the screen because bad things will happen.
Okay.
But if you can just point to the general direction, there's a pointer right there to your right if you want to use that.
Don't touch the screen.
Don't touch the screen.
You can see the ditch right through here. That's almost like a little, I think that's, might be a little footbridge right there over it.
Okay.
And the ditch is running right through here.
Okay, thank you. Have a seat. Let me know when you're ready. Good?
I'm ready.
Okay.
He's explaining that Mr. Arbery is down in the ditch, maybe not quite in the water, but he's down that ditch that way. He's going to start coming up and still kind of running parallel. They're coming up to a tree right here where you can see a sign. I think it's maybe a realtor sign. As they're coming up, he's expecting Mr. Arbery to go maybe around the tree, the other direction, but he ends up coming, sorry, not this tree, this next tree. He's coming up, he's thinking Mr. Arbery is going to go to the left of the tree, but Mr. Arbery actually goes to the right of the tree, so they're right there close to each other at this tree right here. So Mr. Arbery is between the tree on his left and his truck on the right. As they come up, he pushes ahead at this point. He gets ahead of Mr. Arbery, and as he comes into this driveway, he actually angles off, and that's where he was trying to stop his movement. He was trying.
Okay, sorry. Now, in this actual reenactment, did Mr. Bryan ever say that at this point he tried to corner Mr. Arbery?
No, ma'am, he did not.
Did he say he tried to block him?
He did not.
Okay.
He is angling off into Mr. Arbery's direction and Mr. Arbery's path of travel. At this point, he says his window's down. He realizes that he's put himself in a bad position, and he starts to back up. And it's somewhere in that time frame where the contact is made between Mr. Arbery and the vehicle. Whether or not Mr. Arbery is reaching for the door handle or whether he's just touching the truck, that's where the contact is made. And Mr. Bryan said he was worried at this point, so he put the vehicle in drive, and that's when he took off ahead of Mr. Arbery again. Here he's turning off of Burford onto Satilla Shores, or Satilla Drive.
Okay, so is that this road right here?
Yes, ma'am, it is. We've just passed Holmes Road, and he, at this point, stops, backs up as Mr. Arbery makes the turn down Holmes Road. At this point, Mr. Arbery is ahead, and Mr. Bryan is essentially chasing Mr. Arbery down Holmes Road.
Is this Holmes Road right here?
Yes, ma'am. As we get down the road here, you're going to see I think you'll be able to see a brightly colored mailbox. I believe at the time it was blue. And that was an important marker because that was where the video that he took on February 23rd began. You could see the actual brightly colored mailbox.
Okay.
So it was
Are we able to see the mailbox right now?
yes, ma'am.
Okay. Is it this one right here?
Through my dirty windshield, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay.
So we pause. He confirms he's on the left side of the road at that time when the video starts. You actually see at this point in the video, and that's what we're talking about, is you see Mr. Arbery, I think he was briefly running away and then comes running back towards Mr. Bryan in the video. Mr. Bryan believed that Mr. Arbery ran down his passenger side, I believe.
Okay. So at this point, is Mr. Bryan still driving on the wrong side of the road?
Yes, ma'am. We're discussing just different angles and where things were coming and going and referencing back to the actual video that he took in February. He's told me somewhere at that point, after Mr. Arbery passed him, that he had gotten back over onto the right side of the road. Now, during this portion of the actual video on the day of the incident in February, he had dropped the phone, or put it on his lap, I think was what it was. So he's telling us what happened here, and he's saying how he went down a little bit farther. Now, the mailbox you see right there on the right side with the driveway, that's actually another marker that we can kind of identify from the actual video on the day of the incident.
Which one?
Yep, right there to the right.
Okay.
That black mailbox and driveway is something it looks like fresher concrete. You can just tell with the, I guess the landscaping kind of you can identify it in the video. He drives past that, and at some point he decides to turn around and basically does like a 3-point turn where he's talking about on the video, you can hear maybe his tires trying to catch on gravel, and he's showing me where one of two spots he likely, pulled over to the left, backed in, and then pulled back out to the left to go back the direction that Mr. Arbery came, back to the intersection of Holmes Road and Satilla Drive.
So at this point, where's Mr. Arbery?
Mr.
Which
Arbery
direction?
is going to be, well, if you're looking at it from my truck, he's going to be to the left, which is close to the intersection of where the incident occurred, basically.
So going back towards the intersection.
That's correct. And here, if you pause right here, this is where we know that the video where he picked up at because of that driveway. And in the video we're talking about, you can see the curve of the road and trying to figure out, where he was in the road. He says he's kind of center of the road. We're going around, and at which point he actually sees Mr. Arbery. And we're determining where it was that he stopped at when he actually finally stopped and finished taking the video. We're inching up to the spot where he thinks he was. If you see the stop sign there, you can see the intersection. That's the intersection of where the incident occurred.
Okay. And does he essentially stop
Yes, ma'am.
right there?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, Agent Seacrist, throughout that entire reenactment video with Mr. Bryan, did he ever once say that he tried to angle at Mr. Arbery?
I don't recall him saying angle at Mr. Arbery, no.
Okay. Did he ever say that he tried to block Mr. Arbery in?
No, ma'am.
That he tried to corner him at any time?
No, ma'am.
Okay. So none of that was said on that video.
That's correct.
Now, may I approach? Okay. So Agent Seacrist, I'm going to show you what's been marked for the purposes of identification as State's Exhibit 303. Go ahead and look at it and tell me if you recognize it.
Yes, ma'am, I do.
What is it?
This is I guess a map from Google Earth that was created based on Mr. Bryan's statements of his path of travel in the Satilla Shores neighborhood when the incident occurred.
Okay, and was that created by GBI?
Yes, ma'am, it
Okay.
was.
Is it fair and accurate?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
At this time, we tender 303.
No objection.
No objection. To the,
Permission to publish, Your Honor?
go ahead.
Okay.
We're discovering there's about 3 people in the world that can run this thing. One's Mr. Sheffield, one's Ms. Donikowski.
Thank you. Okay. Agent Seacrist, can you see this clearly?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Turn it just like that. And can you step down, please?
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so remember, don't touch the screen. So go ahead and describe to us what we're looking at here on 303.
Okay. What we have is, again, the Satilla Shores neighborhood. You're looking at Satilla Shores. Satilla Shores or Satilla Drive is right here.
Okay.
This drive right here actually comes down here, I believe. This is Burford, right here. This is Holmes, and then this is Zellwood.
Okay.
Highway 17 is going to be up here.
Okay. What is this that we're seeing right here?
That's Mr. English's residence.
Okay. And what is this one?
That's the McMichael residence.
Okay. And just go ahead and show us, what is this one?
That's Mr. Bryan's house.
Okay. So go ahead and just explain the route.
Sure. As you saw in the video, Mr. Bryan's house is right here. He pulls out and eventually turns right out of his residence and comes down here towards Satilla Drive. You see this little part that pulls up on Satilla? That's where he pauses and then backs up down to here before he drives forward onto Holmes. And when he's going down Holmes is when he's initially behind Mr. Arbery. At some point in here would be where Mr. Arbery turns around and comes back towards the intersection while Mr. Bryan continues down somewhere here before he then turns around back to the intersection where the incident occurred.
Okay. And that is based on the reenactment video, what Mr. Bryan told you
Yes, ma'am.
months after the incident actually happened.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. You can have a seat. So, Agent Seacrist, remember we talked about the surveillance system
Yes,
at
ma'am.
Mr. Bryan's house? Now, you said Agent Kelly was there with you when you all were trying to download that?
That's correct.
Okay. And was he the one who actually did the form for that one?
I believe he did, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That is all I have for you. Thank you. The defense might have some questions for you, okay?
All right, this is going to take a while. I need a bathroom break.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, why don't we take a 15-minute recess, sort of mid-afternoon, and we'll get back into the evidence. Thank you.
All rise for adjournment.
All right, Agent, you can go ahead and step down. If you could please be back within about 10 minutes to be ready to go. I remind you, you're under oath. Please do not discuss your testimony with anybody. Yes, thank you. All right, we're in recess for 15 minutes. right, we've got the defendants represented by counsel. Got the witness back on the stand. Mr. Goff, are you ready to proceed?
I believe so, Your Honor.
All right. I remind you are under oath. Let's go ahead and get the panel.
All rise for the juries, ladies. Please be seated.
All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are ready to go ahead and proceed with the evidence. Mr. Goff.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, Agent Seacrist.
Good afternoon.
Do I recall correctly that it was you who called Roddy Bryan
When?
initially? You reached out to Mr. Bryan.
I did. I knocked on his door.
It wasn't Mr. Bryan looking for the spotlight.
That's correct.
And is it fair to say at this point that you needed his cooperation?
I desired his cooperation, yes.
You wanted it. You wanted his cooperation.
Sure.
And that's because under Georgia law, witnesses are not required to talk to you.
No one is required to talk to me.
Because you are not a federal agent.
I'm sorry?
You're not a federal agent. You're a GBI agent.
That's correct.
And you don't have the power to compel witnesses to speak to you.
That's correct.
So they do it voluntarily.
That's correct.
Now, Mr. Bryan had already given several statements to the Glynn County Police Department, had he not?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And he'd already given the Glynn County Police Department his cell phone several times. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But the first thing that you need to do is you need to secure his cell phone again. That's your first mission, is to secure his cell phone.
My first mission?
Yes, sir. There was a lot of controversy surrounding this now famous video, wasn't there?
Controversy. I don't know about controversy as far as the video. There was. People did not like what the video showed, for sure.
For sure. And there was a lot of speculation out there about the video.
And I'm going to object to any speculation, Judge.
Oh, I'm not asking him to provide details. I'm just asking whether he'll acknowledge that there was a need for the GBI to obtain that cell phone.
Go ahead.
Was there a need?
Yes, sir.
There was.
Okay. In fact, as it turned out, there was another important video in this case, or set of videos, were there not?
If you're referring to the videos at his house, yes, sir.
The Night Owl videos.
That's correct.
Somehow, in their exhaustive investigation, the Glynn County Police Department, for whatever reason, did not obtain those videos.
That's correct.
And you were unaware of the existence of those videos until Mr. Roddy Bryan brought them to your attention.
Yes, sir.
Now, directing your attention to May 11th, did you tell Roddy Bryan that the past week had probably been one of the worst of his life?
Yes, sir.
And he agreed with you.
That's correct.
I believe you've already testified that the McMichael defendants had been arrested.
That's correct.
The GBI director, Vic Reynolds, had given a press conference, and your
And I'm
agency...
going to object to anything from the press conference, Judge. That's hearsay.
I have no intention of going into the contents of the press conference. But your boss, former Cobb County DA Vic Reynolds, at that time GBI director, had actually given a press conference in this case.
Yes, sir. That's correct.
You were physically present when he did so.
Yes, sir, I was.
Okay. And whether you were present, you were aware there was a press release.
Yeah, I'm aware there were press releases going on.
And when you were speaking with Mr. Bryan, what you described as media and quote-unquote other entities were blowing the situation up even more.
Objection to relevance, Your Honor, in terms of the relevance of what Agent Seacrist thought about the media.
Based on the conversations we had yesterday outside the presence of the jury, I thought the import of this line of question was clear.
If you're asking the court that, no.
Okay.
So,
Well, I'm at the court's direction, but the circumstances surrounding under which statements are made is relevant to their admissibility.
so ask your question again.
Did you describe when you spoke with Mr. Bryan the media and quote-unquote other entities quote-unquote blowing it up even more? Directing your attention to page 12 of the transcript.
And Judge, I'll renew my objection.
Yeah, but let's see where this is going. Go ahead.
Page
Refresh your
12.
memory, look at page 12 of the
Yes,
transcript.
sir. On which transcript?
The 511.
Okay.
And at any point in time, if you're not sure what I'm asking you about, don't hesitate to let me know.
Thank you. Yes, that's correct.
All right. And you noted that the media was already parked out front of Mr. Bryan's residence when you first attempted to make contact with him.
Your Honor, again, relevance.
Go ahead.
Yes, the media was there.
And that media craze only got worse in the days to follow.
The media was present.
Okay. And again on 5/13, 2 days later, when you speak with Mr. Bryan again, you acknowledge that the past 2 days have been, quote, difficult for Mr. Bryan, unquote.
Yes, sir.
Because there's even more media now.
Is that a quote?
I don't think that's a quote. But there were more media.
I'm sorry, you're asking me a question?
I'll move on. You discussed with Mr. Bryan the march through his neighborhood. Page 139 on your 513 transcript.
I do recall that.
You sympathize with unusual activity in the neighborhood.
Yes, sir.
You've previously agreed that in the context of this interview in May of 2020, that this was a neighborhood on edge.
That's correct.
And by this time, Mr. Bryan fears for his own personal safety and that of his
Objection
family.
to speculation.
Directing your attention to page 142 of what I believe is the JVD transcript.
So which transcript?
The transcript on his prior testimony in this trial.
Why don't you give her a date? Let's zero everybody in.
Fair enough.
Volume 1 of the proceedings of May 13, 2021. Do you have that transcript, sir?
Not here on the stand with me, no, sir.
I think I have it. It's an excerpt of your testimony.
Okay, thank you. What page?
Directing your page to page 142.
I'm sorry, which statement, which part of it?
Page 142, lines 3 through 7.
Yes, sir.
Do you recall being asked whether Mr. Bryan and his fiancée related multiple occasions, incidents that gave them concern for their personal safety?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall Mr. Bryan's fiancée, Amy, giving you a threatening letter that she pulled out of her mailbox?
Hearsay, Judge. Anything in that letter is hearsay. And relevance as to Amy Elrod.
I'll
It's not a
rephrase.
party in this case.
I'll rephrase. In the presence of Roddy Bryan, did his fiancée, Amy Elrod, give you a letter that she pulled out of her mailbox?
Same objection, Your Honor. I don't know if there's any
It's certainly not
evidence.
hearsay. We haven't gone into the contents of the
Yeah,
letter.
and what's the relevance of it? Is there any evidence that Mr. Bryan read the letter? I mean, what?
I'll rephrase. Did Mr. Bryan ask you to do something to help protect him?
I don't recall that directly. I
You
know
did-
there were general concerns about his personal safety,
Yes, sir.
and there were multiple conversations about it.
All right. Is it fair to say that Mr. Bryan was very much concerned about speaking with you at this time?
Objection to speculation, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase. Would you describe Mr. Bryan as scared?
Not of me.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean scared of you, but scared generally.
Because of the situation in the neighborhood, yes, sir.
Okay. And you still need his help.
I would like his assistance, yes.
And the last thing you want Mr. Bryan to do is freak out.
I don't want anybody to freak out.
You certainly don't want him to shut down because you want his help.
I'd like to get statements from anybody involved in an investigation.
Sir, I want to direct your attention to the bottom of the bottom half of page, I'm sorry, the bottom 2/3 of page 3 of the transcript, the 511 transcript. May I approach the witness, Chairman?
Yes.
Sir, I'm showing you an enlargement of page 3 of that transcript, that portion.
Is there an exhibit number?
No, this is not marked for the exhibit. The full transcript is already an exhibit, correct? Do you recall that conversation?
Yes, sir, I do.
Okay. Can you read that conversation to me?
From the ones you handed to me?
Yeah, or you can read the smaller print on the document, either way.
I stated, I do appreciate you. You said you would call me back, and you did. And you said you wanted to talk, and you are. I appreciate that. I want to tell you thank you. Like I told, Mr. Goff said, Kevin, and I responded, Kevin, yeah. It takes me a second sometimes. You know, at this point, you're a witness, you know. That's kind of what we've developed. Or I shouldn't say developed, but determined by listening to all the evidence and the statements and watching videos. There are things that we have questions on, and that we'd like to I guess be a little more specific than what we've been able to see, you know. But I do appreciate you coming in.
And that is what you said?
Yes, sir, that is what I said at that point in time.
No. It was important for you to let Mr. Bryan know that he was a witness in this matter.
It was important for him to know that I appreciated him calling me back like he said he would after my initial contact with him. It was important that he know what his role was at this point in time. And I wanted him to understand that I was looking at this objectively from a fresh set of eyes and not going strictly off what Glynn County Police Department had relayed.
Now, when you told him that you had reviewed the previous statements to the Glynn County Police Department and the other evidence in the case, you weren't lying to him, were you?
I was not.
You did actually. You had all that information available to you.
Yes, sir.
And you know that the Glynn County Police Department had referred to him as a witness.
I don't recall that specifically, but if it's in there, it's in there.
Okay. Well, you reviewed their case file.
I did, in pieces, I would say.
And when you became involved in this case, the Glynn County Police Department listed him as a witness.
Asked and answered.
I don't think so, but I'll defer to the court.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, go ahead. If you notice, go ahead.
The Glynn County Police Department had identified him as a witness in this matter.
I don't recall.
Okay, fair enough. But you told him that he was a witness.
I told him at that point in time.
Which would be consistent, as far as you know, with everything he had been led to believe.
Objection to speculation as far as what Mr. Bryan was led to believe.
I'll move on. You had Mr. Bryan execute a consent form, I believe. Now, I'm showing you what's been marked State's Exhibit 197. Thank you. I believe you read that to the jury earlier.
Yes, sir, I did.
Where in there does it tell Mr. Bryan what he's under investigation for?
It doesn't.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
I would add, though, that he knew what the investigation was about, being as the whole case was around Ahmaud Arbery and his death.
Well, we'll come back to that. Maybe I slept through it earlier, but where was the Miranda form that you used on this occasion?
He was not under arrest. Miranda is only required when somebody's being questioned while they're in custody. At no time was Mr. Bryan in custody during these questioning. As a matter of fact, he was advised from the beginning that he was free to leave and that he was free to stop talking at any time, to which Mr. Goff was present during those conversations.
Well, let's be clear. You were under no legal obligation to give Mr. Bryan Miranda rights, but you could have.
There was no reason to.
But you could have.
I could do a lot of things, but there's no reason to read him Miranda if he is not in custody or there's no chance of him being put into custody at that time.
You've never Mirandized somebody who wasn't in custody?
I do a lot of different things depending on an investigation. The statutes and case law gives us parameters for which we have to work through. What I do in one case may be different than another based on the circumstances of that case. There's no straight cookie cutter approach to this. The point is to always get the information that's needed in the investigation so that you can make a reasonable decision on charges should they be made or not.
But in this case, there was a specific reason why you did not Mirandize Mr. Bryan.
That's correct, because he was not in custody.
When you fill out a Miranda form, are you not required to tell the subject what you're investigating them for?
No, sir.
No? You don't do that.
Objection to relevance of a Miranda form, Judge, when we've already established that a Miranda form was not given in this case.
With all respect, the credibility of all witnesses is a matter for the jury, even police
It's the
officers.
state. He sort of said he didn't Mirandize.
All right. You never used the terms citizen arrest in this conversation, any of these interviews.
Neither myself or Mr. Bryan discussed citizen arrest. No, sir.
Okay. You discussed other legal concepts, did you not?
Which ones?
Such as self-defense.
I don't recall that specifically. Do you have a reference?
No, you don't recall that at all.
If you have a reference, to refresh my memory, but I don't recall that specifically.
Well, we'll circle back to that. You did discuss whether Mr. Bryan was scared on the side of the road.
Again, do you have a specific reference?
Did you discuss whether Mr. Bryan took defensive action to pull away from Mr. Arbery when he felt Mr. Arbery was trying to get in his truck? Did you not testify to that earlier today?
Not in relation to self-defense, but in relation to the series of events that occurred prior to Mr. Arbery's death, then yes, we discussed that.
All right. Now, shortly into the interview, concern became apparent as to what your intentions were, did it not?
Concern for who?
There was concern on the part of Mr. Bryan as to what your intentions were.
Objection to speculation about concern of Mr. Bryan.
Well, we don't have to speculate, Your Honor.
Let's rephrase.
Directing your attention to page 21 of the transcript,
Which transcript?
the 511 transcript. 18 pages. After this colloquy on page 3. Did you get a chance to review page 21?
Is there a certain area that you want me to, that you're
Yeah.
referencing?
Tell us about the part where the interview stops. Matter of fact, you just go. I don't have line numbers on my copy.
Okay.
But from the part where it says, okay, I'll step outside a minute.
Okay. In the beginning, I guess to give some context, in the beginning of this interview, Mr. Goff had even reminded Mr. Bryan, while I was telling him about the voluntariness of the interview, Mr. Goff reminded him that at any point we could pause the interview so that Mr. Bryan could confer with his attorney on any questions he may have. And that's, I think, what is occurring right here. Mr. Bryan starts off on this page stating, he asked me, and I don't exactly remember right now what exactly he said, other than he was just saying that.
Objection, Judge, may we approach?
That wasn't me.
Well, you directed him to it.
No, I directed him to the breaking the conversation.
May we approach, Your Honor?
attention to line 4. Well, it's the 4th line. I know there are no line numbers, but line 4. How does this part of the conversation begin?
I stated, okay, I'll step outside a minute.
And then who says what next?
Mr. Goff says, no, you step outside. Or, I'm sorry, not you step outside, we'll step outside. And Mr. Bryan said, yeah, I was going to step outside. And I said, yeah, that's fine, Roddy, have a seat.
And then what do I say?
Mr. Goff says, right, you stay, we're stepping out.
And Mr. Bryan says,
Okay.
and then you say,
No, you're good, you're good.
and then I say,
We're stepping out. Okay,
and then you and I stepped out.
that's correct.
And when we came back in, what did you tell Mr. Bryan?
I know not everybody talks to the police every day, and I know this is a very stressful situation, but you know, we're going to be okay here.
And Mr. Bryan says,
Okay,
okay. And then you say,
all right, we're going to be okay. I mean, nothing has changed. When we're done here, you're going home. Okay?
and Mr. Bryan said,
Okay.
because he's just a witness.
I believe that our question or our conversation outside was to Roddy's nervousness about talking to police and his trouble recalling events. And I believe you were speaking for your client as to his ability to recall events.
Because it's an issue. It's an issue when you're dealing with him that day.
I don't remember it being as much of an issue for him as it was for you.
Really? Okay. All right. Now, on May 11th, Mr. Bryan gave you an hour-plus interview, did he not?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Hour and 15?
Something like that.
And on May 13th, he comes back and gives you a 2-hour interview?
That's correct.
And he speaks with you in his home, does he not?
The May 13th interview for 2 hours?
In addition to the 2-hour interview at the DNR headquarters, he invites you into his home and meets with you in his home.
That's correct. After discussions with you, it was advised that we could go to his home. I believe that was to download the Night Owl camera system. It was not an interview. It was a matter of gathering evidence.
And you spoke with him out in the front yard.
Not about the facts of the case as much as it was the, again, the logistics of the video and everything else.
And you're speaking with him down when you're getting his fingerprints.
After you and I had already had a conversation where I promised I wouldn't ask any questions about the case during that time because you weren't present.
Because you had built a relationship of trust with Mr. Bryan.
Which I try to do with all of my witnesses and all of my people that I discuss with cases, whether it be subjects, whether it be witnesses, to the point where I've gotten text messages thanking me from people that I've arrested because I've treated them fairly.
And in case it wasn't clear earlier, in all these interviews that transpire over several hours, you're discussing a lot of different subjects.
Yes.
Path of travel is only one of those.
I'm sorry, say it again.
Path of travel, the video, the now famous video, that's one of the subjects of those conversations.
You mean the recorded interview conversations?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I mean, you're not grilling Mr. Bryan for 2 hours at a time, an hour and a half at a time about this one subject.
No, these interviews are very conversational in nature about the events that happened on that day, before and after.
And it was through no fault of yours, but Mr. Bryan nevertheless had trouble articulating what was going on that day.
No, sir.
He did it?
You said it was no fault
It was no fault of yours. You were trying to work with him.
I was working with him. Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, on May 11th and May 13th, did Mr. Bryan appear at any time to be mentally unstable?
No, sir.
Did he appear to be under the influence of alcohol, drugs, or other intoxicants?
No, sir.
Was Mr. Bryan loud or boisterous?
No, sir.
Did he come across to you as gleeful or bragging or boastful?
No, sir.
Did he strike you as someone seeking attention, seeking the spotlight?
No, sir.
Did Mr. Bryan drop F-bombs or otherwise use profanity when you were talking to him?
No, sir.
Was Mr. Bryan in any way disrespectful to you?
He was not.
Okay. Now, there are times in the transcript where you and Mr. Bryan are discussing the deceased in this case,
That's
Mr.
correct.
Arbery, by his first name.
That's correct.
Okay. In doing so, you didn't mean any disrespect.
I don't see that as disrespectful.
Okay. And certainly when Mr. Arbery said his name, you didn't take that as a disrespect towards Mr. Arbery.
When Mr. Arbery said his name,
When Mr. Bryan said Mr. Arbery's first name, you didn't take that as a sign of disrespect.
no, sir.
Did you ask Mr. Bryan how far he got in school on either May 11th or May 13th?
Not to my recollection, but I think he did tell me that he graduated from Brunswick, if I remember correctly.
Did you ask him whether he had any learning disabilities?
No, sir.
Did you ask him whether he could read and write the English language?
I don't recall specifically if I asked that one.
You don't recall him replying most of it?
I do recall that. Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Bryan never denied following Mr. Arbery, did he?
That's correct.
And while he might not have used the word, Mr. Bryan never denied angling his vehicle ahead of Mr. Arbery.
He never denied angling his vehicle in that direction. His choice of words changed drastically from the point of the Glynn County interview to the point of his interview with me.
I'm sorry, did I ask you whether he changed his wording, or did I ask you whether he denied angling his vehicle in front of Mr. Arbery?
Objection, Your Honor. The witness is allowed to explain his answer, which I believe is what he just did.
What a witness does is answer yes or no, and then they can explain.
Why don't you state your question again? Go ahead.
Roddy Bryan never denied during his interview with you that he angled his vehicle ahead of Mr. Arbery.
That's correct. He never denied. He just changed the descriptive words that he used in his involvement in the incident that day.
Didn't you just tell the jury when the district attorney was playing this reenactment? Didn't you just tell this jury, as you pull the truck in where the driveway is in the ditch, didn't you just show them on the video him angling and say that he did that? You just didn't use the word.
Yes, sir. He said that he did that during the reenactment video with me, but the wording was different than his explanation when he was interviewed by the Glynn County Police Department.
But based on your video, whether he used the same words or not, he conveyed the same meaning.
He conveyed the same meaning with different intent.
You know what's in Mr. Bryan's mind?
I don't know what's in his mind, but the use of the English language and the words can give some insight into a person's intent.
Are you trying to speculate as to what was in Mr. Bryan's mind?
I'm not speculating in what is in his mind. I guess I would be explaining what the meaning that I took to those words and what I would say as a general meaning to those words.
Roddy Bryan never denied cutting in ahead of Mr. Arbery, did he?
At which point?
At any point. In your conversation with him, did he ever deny cutting in ahead of Mr. Arbery?
No, he was factually correct in his movements that day during his interview with me.
Okay. Now, beyond that, what you're really doing in this video and this narrative you've just given the jury is you're largely speculating, aren't you?
About?
What happened?
I'm giving insight on what I was told that had happened on the day of the incident.
Okay. Was that Mr. Bryan's testimony, the words you were using when the video was playing, or was that your spin on it?
That would be me paraphrasing what Mr. Bryan told me during that reenactment video.
Mr. Bryan let you know that he didn't think you could do this.
Do the reenactment video?
Mr. Bryan let you know many times that he was struggling to remember events 2.5 months later.
Which is not uncommon for anybody that has to recall events afterwards. But it doesn't stop me from being able to ask the questions. That's my job as an investigator.
Because you needed this reenactment video.
Actually, you offered the video prior to the interview. You referenced that Mr. Bryan had a hard time remembering the path of travel in a narrative format, and that he was willing to take that path of travel after the interview.
So you took that as the green light to put words in Mr. Bryan's mouth.
I never put words in Mr. Bryan's mouth.
One moment, John.
We're making sure we're looking at the same thing. Yes. Sir, is it fair to say that what you did on May 13th in that car was a rehearsal before you recorded it?
I'm sorry, repeat that question?
You rehearsed this video with Mr. Bryan before you recorded it.
Yes, there was a discussion as far as Mr. Bryan's ability to recall exactly what happened. So we did refresh the events prior to actually doing the recording.
So it was practiced. You did a practice run before you turned the video on.
It was a run to refresh his memory because he was having a hard time with the path of travel.
May I show you the investigative summary you prepared?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Your investigative summary indicates that...
Objection to hearsay, Your Honor, from the summary. If he's trying to refresh his recollection, then that's one thing, but not read from the actual document.
Have you refreshed your recollection now?
I don't believe the witness ever said that he couldn't remember anything.
I'll rephrase. In your written summary, you acknowledge the difficulty Mr. Bryan had in determining his path of travel 2.5 months later.
Yes, just like I stated earlier, he needed an opportunity to refresh his memory.
And it was only after you refreshed his memory that the video was turned on.
I did not refresh his memory. It was impossible for me to refresh Mr. Bryan's memory. I was not there on February 23rd. I could only go off the statements that Mr. Bryan provided.
Oh, but it was possible for you to refresh his memory, wasn't it?
Objection to ask and answer, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase. Mr. Bryan has repeatedly said he's having trouble recalling the events of that day, and in all the times that you met with him, and all the times he expressed difficulty, did you ever once offer to show him a copy of his own statement?
No, sir.
You had both of his statements from the Glynn County Police Department at that time, right? You had the video and the transcript. I'm sorry, you had the videos. Okay. Did you? You've indicated you reviewed them. Did you ever once give Mr. Bryan an opportunity to review what he said 2.5 months earlier?
It wouldn't be standard to have somebody review their statement after the fact. The whole point of the GBI coming in to do another investigation of this incident was to try to start the investigative process from the beginning and basically get a fresh start. I wanted Mr. Bryan's statement from his recollection right then, and I could compare it to what he had said earlier and try to determine if there were discrepancies based off memory issues or if there were discrepancies based off of, I'll call it ill intent.
Where in your 5-page written summary do you ever reference Roddy Bryan attempting to run over Mr. Arbery with his truck?
I don't think it's in there.
Would you like to review it?
It's right here, this one?
Yeah.
I don't believe it's in there.
Okay. To be fair, you weren't investigating Roddy Bryan for an aggravated assault with a motor vehicle, were you?
I was investigating Roddy's involvement in the death of Ahmaud Arbery.
Well, certainly, if he had told you that he tried to run Mr. Arbery over with his truck, that would have changed the character of your investigation.
Not necessarily.
Okay. You certainly would have included it in your 5-page summary, wouldn't you?
That's correct.
Because other agents for the GBI and your supervisors are looking at these things as they come in, right?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, you previously testified about an incident where Mr. Arbery, from Mr. Bryan's perspective, appears to be getting in the vehicle.
That's correct.
Or trying.
Yes, sir.
And in fact, he expressed a fear to you later that he was going to try again.
That sounds familiar. Yes, sir.
Directing your attention to page 54 of what I believe is the May 13th transcript.
You said 54?
Page 54.
Okay.
Directing your attention to the middle, where Mr. Bryan begins with, well, at first. He tells you he's trying to get out of the way. Tenth line down.
Yes, sir.
Now, he's trying to get out of the way. He says, for a split second, he says, oh my God, he's coming back at me. You recall that?
Yes, that's right before he continued following Mr. Arbery towards the intersection of Satilla and Holmes.
Yes. So he's telling you that I'm trying to stay as far back as I can from this dude.
Yes, but he had also turned around he was already going away from Mr. Arbery, and he had turned around to come back and follow him.
And when he turned around, and I got that video, that split second, then he's coming back at me, and I'm like, oh, expletive. Excuse me again.
Right.
I don't want to use that 4-letter word.
I understand. Yes, right before he continues following him. Yes, sir.
So he says, and I started kind of evasive action and I dropped the phone. Is that what he said?
Yes, sir.
today, you omitted a key portion of his statement, did you not? You don't know what I'm talking about. Directing your attention to page 40.
Of May 13th?
Yes. I believe May 13th. Do you recall Mr. Bryan specifically telling you that he never intended to strike Mr. Arbery?
On page 40?
I'm sorry, the top of page 41. What's your question for Mr. Bryan? Top of page 41.
I asked him, so, all right, so you never intentionally tried to run him off the road? Mr. Bryan says no. And I think this is referring to the time when he was trying to cut him off in the driveway. And so he's saying that he wasn't trying to actually run him over or hit him.
And actually, you're following up on what he's told you on page 38, where he told you that he got over in his path, but he was too far in front of Mr. Arbery to be a threat to him.
Page 38?
Yes, sir.
Too far in front of him to be running him off the road. That's correct.
Well, technically, if Mr. Arbery didn't stop running, he would have run into Mr. Bryan's truck.
Objection, Judge. Is there a question in there? And it's speculation.
In the context, Mr. Bryan's not denying that he attempted to block his path of travel. He's just pointing out to you that he was a good distance in front of him when he did that.
Objection to compound question, Your Honor.
You can break it down, or if the witness can try and answer that.
If he will, he will. If he won't, I'll rephrase.
Can you repeat it?
Mr. Bryan has acknowledged attempting to block Mr. Arbery's path of travel, but he's told you at page 38 that when he does that, he's sufficiently far in front of him that he's not threatening Mr. Arbery with his vehicle.
That's correct. He's saying that he is trying to stop his movement, but that he's too far in front to make contact. That's correct.
Now, we've discussed in generality Mr. Bryan's struggles reviewing the events of that day. Now, I've got some more specific questions, and I'm sorry, I didn't mean to take you out there. You're going to need that May 13th transcript again, probably. Okay? Mr. Bryan told you that it had been 2.5 months since this incident. That's page 3.
That's correct.
But he promises to do his best, doesn't he?
He says, I'll give you what I can recall.
All right. As far as what took place in front of his house, he tells you it all happened pretty quick, does he not? Page 6.
I believe that's correct, yes.
But now, you've already decided that you're going to direct the conversation, have you not? Directing your attention back to page 3. You agreed to, quote-unquote, direct Roddy Bryan through what happened.
Where are you at?
Page 3 of your 513 of the 513
Yes, sir.
transcript. You use the words, direct Mr. Bryan.
I'm trying to find it. Give me just a second.
I thought I was looking at the May 13th.
Okay, that's what you're asking him to look at?
Yes.
Okay.
I think that's in reference to, let me see. Conversations that you and I had, and I tried to ask open-ended questions to get responses, and it was advised that I probably needed to be a little bit more direct in the questioning to give him guidance on what I was wanting to discuss.
Well, let's be clear. You're not trying to trick Mr. Bryan here. You're simply trying to get the information.
That's correct.
But to do that, you have to direct him.
I have to ask direct questions, but again, a lot of that is based on conversations that Mr. Nagolf and I had regarding Roddy's ability to respond and understand open-ended questions as it related to the things that I was looking to ask about. So I believe you even referenced being more direct with him.
Because, as Mr. Bryan explained to you at page 22, it is hard for him to explain what happened out there.
You're talking about the bottom of the page?
I believe so.
Well, it says, what it actually says is, well, this is going to be hard to explain without kind of really showing you.
Mr. Bryan is telling you he can't put it into words.
Yes, like I explained earlier, Mr. Bryan had a hard time describing things in a narrative format when it came to the path of travel, but that's why he was willing to go afterwards and actually do the drive-through, because he could do it more in that kind of a setting versus just describing it narratively.
Yes, sir. And at page 23, well, before I get there, when you reviewed the Glynn County Police Department report, you did see the map and the squiggles that Mr. Bryan drew on it when he was interviewed by Detective Lowry?
So I knew that there was a map that they were referencing when I was reviewing the video. I actually don't recall seeing the map initially. I know that we got it at some point, but I don't recall actually being able to find it when I was preparing for the interview.
Well, it was fairly obvious at that point that Mr. Bryan's map-making skills would leave a lot to be desired.
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Specifically, Mr. Bryan had trouble recalling details about the carjacking. Directing your attention to page 31.
I don't know of a carjacking.
Attempted carjacking?
I don't know.
I'm sorry, what do you call it when someone tries to get in your motor vehicle?
Just cut the witness off, Your Honor.
I'm sorry, I didn't cut you off. Explain.
I don't know of a carjacking. I know that if someone is being chased through a neighborhood, that there may be different ways that they may deal with that.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But, for example, Mr. Bryan has difficulty recalling whether it is Mr. Arbery's right hand or his left hand which is closest to his door.
That's correct.
Now, you were asked previously whether the transcripts from May 11th and May 13th that you were referring to reflected the full conversation that took place in your car.
There was no conversation in my car on May 11th.
Directing your attention to page 148 of the motion transcript. Page 148. Do you recall being asked whether the transcript of the that goes with the reenactment video reflected the full conversation that took place in your car.
I stated that it reflects the time that we started the reenactment,
The time when you turned on the video.
when we started the reenactment.
Basically, you had so much trouble with Mr. Bryan the first time you went through this with him, you had to start all over again.
I wouldn't call it trouble. I would call it, again, it's been 2.5 months. He had difficulty relaying the exact version of the path of travel. It was better to do a refresh to allow him to refresh his memory before we actually recorded it. The flip side would have been, if we would have started recording it and it was wrong, it would become more confusing. So the idea was to get the best recollection that Mr. Bryan had on the video. And then so prior to that, we did the refresh drive around to make sure that he kind of knew where he was. And Mr. Goff and Mr. Bryan were on board with that during the whole time this occurred.
So when the transcript begins, go, that wasn't really go, was it?
Yes, sir, it was.
That was a do-over.
No, sir,
You wouldn't call it a mulligan?
I would not.
All right. Let's talk about the video transcript itself. Now, I believe you testified earlier that that's what Mr. Bryan told you. You know, what you related to this jury earlier today was true and accurate.
Are you referring to my paraphrasing of events on the video?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Directing your attention to page 2. You tell Mr. Bryan, let's start. You saw them going through. That's you leading Mr. Bryan, is it not?
No, sir. That's me just going back to information that Mr. Bryan had said to me as to how this started.
But basically you're the director of this little movie.
No, sir. What I'm doing is just going back after the refresh and the information that Mr. Bryan had already given and just referencing it during the video. It's like a way of recording it and getting it on record that this is what Mr. Bryan had provided to me, and he's acknowledging it by saying, uh-huh.
And then again on page 2, you're telling him, you kind of see him running.
Yes, sir. Which is, again, goes back to the information that he had already relayed to me during the interview and during the refresh of the drive through the neighborhood.
And again on page 2, you're telling him you already knew.
I'm sorry, where's that? On page 2?
On page 2, we're still on page 2. You're telling
No,
him
sir.
telling him that Mr. Arbery is still in front of you.
No, sir.
No?
No. That is, I'm telling him, the direct quote here is, you already knew, and I use a word to reference Mr. Arbery, was going down that way in the direction that they were angling, or that Mr. Bryan was angling.
All right. Directing your attention to the bottom of page 2, Mr. Bryan's expressing uncertainty about the sequence of events, is he not? Bottom of page 2, he says, quote unquote, he was probably right beside me.
Yes, sir, that's correct, he does.
Page 3, about 8 lines up. You're telling him you're still going.
I'm not telling him, that's a question. The actual line says, you're still going, question mark.
And let's be clear, who's operating the motor vehicle for this video. Is that Mr. Bryan operating the motor vehicle?
No, sir. I'm operating my state-issued GBI truck, and I am following the path of travel and the directions that Mr. Bryan has given me.
Okay.
I'm even asking him about speeds and directions and angles and if I'm doing it correctly.
Well, what Mr. Bryan has told you is that he can't explain it. He needs to show you, right?
That's correct.
Okay. And he's already brought other police officers into his truck, has he not? You're aware that Officer Minshew is actually sitting in Mr. Bryan's truck when he gets the first download of this video, or attempted download.
Okay.
You could have let Mr. Bryan operate the vehicle and show you himself.
That would have been an option.
So it's when you say in here on page 3 something like this, that's not Mr. Bryan telling you how to move the vehicle. That's you moving the vehicle for the camera.
At Mr. Bryan's direction, that's correct.
So he told you to move that way.
Yes, sir.
And where did he tell you to drive that way? Directing your attention to page 3 of the transcript. Where is Mr. Bryan there directing you, telling you how to operate the vehicle?
The whole page. It starts off up at the top. Mr. Bryan states, all right, I'm staying on this side of the road and I'm ahead of them, but I'm not going that fast. There's speed. You can come on down and actually if you go to lines 10, he says, so then I speed up. He talks about how they almost met at the tree. He says, we're real close to each other. And I ask a question, you still going? He replies, yep, straight on through. I sped up a little bit more, a good bit. I kind of left him. And then,
you say
so he is directing this travel through the whole way. He's talking about speed and direction during this whole process.
And then you're saying something like this.
Yes, I'm asking for clarification. I'm asking Mr. Bryan, is what I'm doing with my vehicle the same as what he did on that day on February 23rd?
And after you've done it, you're getting him to agree with you.
I'm asking him a question. I want him to respond yes, if it is correct, and if it's not correct, I want him to respond no and tell me what the correct way is.
And this is all while people are walking through the neighborhood, while all this media craziness is going on, is it not?
We've seen the video. There was, I don't recall seeing anybody on Burford at the point that we're talking about on page 3. I don't believe we start seeing people in the video until we get to the intersection of Holmes and Satilla. So at the point we're talking about here, there's not a whole bunch of people in the street.
But the media circus, while it's not evident in the few minutes of your video, you've already testified about the media circus in this time frame. About the march through the neighborhood, you've already testified about that, have you not?
I have.
Yeah,
But the media circus is not just about what was happening in the neighborhood. There were times where there was media in the neighborhood. There were times that there were other people mulling about the neighborhood that did not appear to live there. But media circus also referenced a lot of other things that were going on beyond just physical activity in the neighborhood.
As you've already testified, Mr. Bryan is in fear for himself and his family.
Objection to mischaracterization and also speculation.
Mr. Bryan has expressed concern for his safety.
Yes, he has.
Okay. Mr. Bryan is trying to please you, is he not?
Objection to speculation about Mr. Bryan pleasing anyone, Judge.
Sustained.
Mr. Bryan is, you would describe this Mr. Bryan telling you what you want to hear?
No, sir. As a matter of fact, Mr. Bryan, even through your cross-examination today, says several times that he's having a hard time remembering. Somebody who's trying to please me would generally just want to answer in whatever way I'm trying to get them to answer. But Mr. Bryan is not doing that. So he's trying to remember what he can recall from 2.5 months before.
And when he's having trouble recalling, you're helping him along.
I can't help him along. I was not there that day. I can't provide those details. I'm not helping him along. I am asking questions, which is my job.
Then why won't you simply show him his statements?
Objection, asked and answered, Your Honor.
It's sustained.
While you're sitting in the car and he's having trouble remembering details, why don't you just share them with him?
Like I said earlier, my goal here is to get his statement for that day of his recollection so that I can compare it as part of the investigative process. We actually have a team of investigators that are working this case. We're discussing it daily. We're going back and we're discussing differences. We want to see those differences so we can use that in the investigation to determine our path and what our decisions are going to be.
But when you've reviewed his prior statements and he can't see them, then he's looking to you to fill in the gaps. That's human nature.
Objection to speculation, Judge.
Let's go ahead and
Now,
it's sustained.
thank you. At page 4, you ask him, is this where Mr. Arbery went for the door?
Yes, sir.
And you're telling him, as you were coming in reverse.
Again, I'm not telling him. The transcripts, both of those quotes of what I said are questions. The first one, okay, is this where he went for the door, question mark? Mr. Bryan says yes. And then I respond, okay, are you coming in reverse? It's a question. Again, it goes back to the information he's already provided, and I'm just helping the narration from what he's already told me so that I can be sure that I understand, which is also in the question format, giving him the opportunity to respond if I've misunderstood it.
And while Mr. Bryan is talking to you, your phone rings during the video, does it not?
I believe hearing my phone ring somewhere in there. I think so.
It unfortunately interrupts Mr. Bryan at an important part of your reenactment.
When my phone rang, it did not ring continuously until it went to voicemail. My recollection is that I silenced it once it started ringing.
But Mr. Bryan corrects you in the actual audio of this video. He says, I might have been in drive by then, as opposed to being in reverse, as you testified to. You don't recall him saying that?
I don't recall. Yes, I recall him unsure of the exact time that he believed Mr. Arbery reached for the door. It was more of it happened quickly, and it either happened while I was in reverse or after I'd gone into drive. It was more of a difficult in recalling the exact moment because of how quickly it occurred.
And Mr. Bryan added, which you did not mention today, I wasn't looking back there at him.
That's right. But again, I was paraphrasing the statement that Mr. Bryan gave me.
He was trying to figure out where Mr. Arbery was going and get out of here. That's what he told you.
That's correct. Right before he continued to chase Mr. Arbery down home the road.
Now, in the video, we see you pulling up by the ditch at a driveway where he's angled. You remember that?
Yes, that was before. Actually, that's right the same time frame. That's correct.
Now, when you're driving the car, when you back up, you're not backing up at the angle that Mr. Bryan is reported pulling in. You're not backing up the angle that you pulled in. You're backing up at an angle more towards Mr. Arbery.
I'm backing up at the direction of Mr. Bryan.
Where did Mr. Bryan tell you that he backed straight up? Where in that transcript does he tell you that?
He doesn't tell me that specifically, nor does he correct it the way that I'm doing it at that time.
Because maybe at that time Mr. Arbery doesn't understand that might be important.
Mr. Arbery?
Mr. Bryan.
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan understood at that time, Your Honor.
Because you still haven't explained to Mr. Bryan that you're looking at whether there's an aggravated assault.
Well, sustained. Was there a question there?
There is. When you're going through this part of this with Mr. Bryan, you have not told him that you're looking at an aggravated assault.
At this point in time, I'm still looking at the case as a whole and what his involvement was. I wouldn't even say that specifically at this time I was thinking about aggravated assault.
Okay. So Neither you nor Mr. Bryan know that that angle has any actual importance at the time you're making this video.
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan knew at that time, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase. You weren't deliberately trying to mislead Mr. Bryan when you angled, when you reversed in the way that you weren't deliberately trying to mislead him. It didn't occur to you at that time that it mattered.
I did not deliberately mislead Mr. Bryan at any time. The angle, the exact angle of how Mr. Bryan backed up, again, he did not correct what I did. And so that was the best representation of what I have as to what happened that day.
Now, as in the video, you show Mr. Bryan pulling up ahead after the backing up. You show him pulling ahead. But in your testimony this morning, you didn't talk about the speed at which Mr. Bryan was moving.
Okay.
Mr. Bryan told you that that moment when he pulls away is the fastest that he's traveling during this entire incident, doesn't he?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But you didn't mention that.
Again, I didn't mention that. It was a paraphrase of what Mr. Bryan told me during that reenactment.
All right. Now, I believe you testified about Mr. Bryan backing up again, this time when he's driven past Holmes, correct?
Yes, sir. That's correct.
But when he's backing up, he's not backing up at Mr. Arbery, is he?
No, sir. Not to my knowledge.
Because Mr. Arbery's going up the other street.
I don't know the exact time that Mr. Arbery would have gone up the other street in relation to when Mr. Bryan was backing up.
I'm going to get this right before this trial is over. This little squiggle here, you see that?
Yes, sir.
That's pretty important in this case, isn't it?
Objection, Judge.
I'll rephrase.
To relevance about what Agent Seacrist.
I'll rephrase. In the entire interview that you conducted with Mr. Bryan, did you ever ask him about Matt Albenzi?
Not to my recollection.
As far as your entire interview with Mr. Bryan has no idea where Mr. Albenzi is.
As far as I know.
But Mr. Arbery knows where Mr. Albenzi is.
Objection to what Mr. Arbery knew, Your Honor.
I'll rephrase. In your course of your investigation, you discovered that Mr. Arbery had run out of 220 Satilla,
That's correct.
the English residence,
Yes, sir.
and run down toward Mr. Bryan's residence.
That's correct. Well, towards, in that direction. Yes, sir.
And Mr. Bryan's got the music playing out front, right?
Yes, sir.
So he can't see or hear. He has no idea Mr. Albenzi's down there.
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan knew.
Do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Bryan was aware of Mr. Albenzi's presence out there?
Whether Mr. Bryan knew that Mr. Albenzi,
Yeah.
I don't know that Mr. Albenzi was still standing out there at that point in time.
But he had been there only minutes before.
He had been there at the time that Mr. Albenzi made the phone call to the non-emergency line. That's correct.
And that would explain why Mr. Arbery turns up the other street.
Objection to speculation about why the victim did what he did.
But Mr. Bryan doesn't know any of that, does he?
Objection to speculation about what Mr. Bryan knew.
Mr. Bryan doesn't tell you he's aware of that.
That's correct.
He tells you he's surprised that Mr. Arbery turns up Holmes.
Is that in the transcript?
I believe it is, but I'm not going to go look for the reference now. But you can.
Yeah, let's just take a short moment. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's just go ahead and take a 5-minute recess.
All right for the jury.
I'm going to have you just step down for a moment. If you could just wait up. Oh, yes, sir. Okay, we're going to take a short recess. Mr. Goff, how long are you planning to take with this witness? Because we spent a long time on one video, so I'm wondering where you're going with all of this.
We're going to try and find a way to speed it up.
Well, I'm not asking you to speed it up. Well, it'd be great if you could. Obviously, I want to give you the opportunity, but I'm just trying to figure out from a timing standpoint where we are. I thought when we started we were in pretty good shape for the day.
I'd very much like to finish today.
I plan on finishing this witness today, so I'm trying to get some idea on where we are.
Pretty close. Thanks.
Okay. I have no idea what that means, but let's go ahead and take a short recess and we'll come back at it. Maybe we can get a better idea when I get back.
Thank you, Your Honor.
file. From the state, somebody wanted to go, let's check with the witness.
I will check with you.
Actually, I probably need to instruct the witness, so let's bring the witness in. All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are at a point we're going to go ahead and break for the day. So we're going to ask that you be back here at 9 o'clock Monday morning for a continuation of the evidence in this case. Now we're breaking for the weekend. Okay, so let me just remind you of the instructions that I've given you. Again, do not discuss this case with anyone. Do not go looking for any information about the case. And don't let anybody discuss this case with you or approach you about the case. Don't let anybody talk about it in your presence of hearing. Don't go picking up newspapers. Don't go looking at social media. If you're out and about over the weekend and you are around people that are talking about the case or want to talk about the case, you need to walk away. You need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And if it does, you need to go ahead and notify the court when you return on Monday. Does everybody understand the court's instructions? Any nods from everybody? All right. With that, thank you for the week. Thank you for participating in this case with us here in the Superior Court of Glynn County. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your attention. We'll see you Monday morning at 9 o'clock. Thank you.
All rise for the jury. Stated.
Anything from the state before we recess?
Nothing from the state.
From Travis McMichael.
No, Your Honor.
From Greg McMichael.
No, Your Honor.
From Roddy Bryan.
No, Your Honor.
All right, we will see everybody 9 o'clock Monday morning. Stay safe this weekend. Have a good weekend. Thank you.